in the US during the pandemic. And this has been an incredible shock to the economy. And it has also been an extraordinary experiment for policy, economic policy, health policy intervention. So we're gonna focus on the economic aspect of the policy intervention. And let me give you a little bit of an overview of what we plan to cover. So we will talk about first about the rationale for the response and issues about financing. Then I will talk about 3 specific income support programs that were introduced between March and April of 2020. And we will see how effective they were using some very simple metrics. Then I will pass the discussion to Paola, who will focus on the consumption or the scarcity of some very important essential goods and services during this time. So let's actually understand the framework for discussing the policy intervention. So the federal government between the early April and the end of between the early March and the end of April, actually approved spending for approximately $4 trillion, which is an incredible amount relative to any historical precedents. It's as similar as a war spending. And why did we need to spend so much money? I mean, it was necessary because the pandemic created a lot of problems to the economy, a lot of problems to individuals. And so the federal government wanted to provide relief and support to the individual and businesses who could not operate as in normal times. Why? Because they could not even produce goods and services, they could not consume goods and services, and as a result, there was a contraction of the availability of income. An additional reason why there was the need for the federal support was the fact that state and local governments also had to spend a lot of money and resources on pandemic-related goods and services. Plus, the contraction in economic activity reduced revenue to these local governments. Local governments and state governments in the US have very tight budget constraints. They must run a balanced budget. So in the presence of such an incredible shock, there was a need for federal government funding. So in addition, so we saw about the micro component, which is providing relief and support. But at the same time, the pandemic brought a significant recession. And so there was also the one rationale for this intervention was to prevent damage that was associated to this very strong recession. So let's take a look at the entity of the spending. So just so we may have heard the names of these acts over time, reading the newspaper, reading, learning about the government response to the crisis. And as you can see here, the CARES Act on March 27 represents the highest spending appropriation of nearly $3 trillion. And so an important question at this point is that many of the spending that was approved in April is soon going to expire. And we'll talk about this at the very end. It's going to expire at the end of this week. So the issue is, are we done or do we need a further support to the economy? And we'll try to address this in our talk. So if the government spent so much money, 18%, or there was an appropriation, so it was not entirely spent. But when there is more spending, primarily in transfers, and there is less revenue, because there was actually a voluntary cut in taxes, the government budget, the government debt is expected to increase a lot. So given the circumstances, people, economists, even the most fiscal conservatives are actually saying, this time it's different. We should not worry about the debt dynamics. At the same time, the US Treasury benefited from a strong support from the Federal Reserve, who maintained interest rates low and accommodated the need for greater borrowing by the Treasury, and also purchase the government debt by reducing the amount of debt in the hands of the public. Historically, also other countries have always craved US bonds. You know, is it going to last forever? Who knows? But that also supported the fact that up to this point, we should not worry about fiscal sustainability issues. So now let's actually take a look at 3 specific income support programs. So we're talking about how the government is trying to provide relief, has tried to provide relief. And I will talk about these 3 programs: the economic income payments, which are checks given to families; the unemployment assistance, which has actually benefits to the unemployed; and the Paycheck Protection Program is an interesting program because it targets employment by giving a loan to firms instead. And let's see their features and their and how they have worked, given the data that economists have collected up to this point. So let's talk about this economic income payment. So these are checks that provided that the income of 2018 was below a certain threshold, was actually benefiting families, $1,200 per adult and $500 per child. And this, despite some implementation delays, according to some, because they wanted to make sure that there was a signature on these checks, but it has had a positive effect on individual consumption. And also, despite fears, this consumption has focused on essential goods. So some people anecdotally were afraid that if you were giving such a substantial amount of money to families, families may have spent this check on video games or things that are non-essential. But it turns out that the evidence so far supports that those who received it actually paid their bills and purchase essential goods and services, which is a good thing. Also, what is important is that it has been shown that those who had the lower income or lower liquidity, less liquid instruments available before receiving the check, actually responded more by consuming more. So as a result, the policy implication is that targeting these groups of people is actually going to have a stronger effect on aggregate consumption. So that's an important lesson to take from these economic income payments. Of course, the problem is that it was done only once in April, and the question for the future is, do we need another situation like this? And many people are actually proposing this another time. So perhaps there's going to be another impact payment program. The second program, which is also controversial, it was actually somewhat more controversial. The economic impact program payment program was quite supported by everyone. These are unemployment checks. And this is actually a boost of $600 per week to people who are unemployed. And this boost goes above the unemployment check that people already received from the state or sometimes from a union. And so it turns out that these checks have had a very important success in separating income loss so job loss with income loss, because it turns out that this boost was actually very significant for several people. 50% of the unemployed, because of this program, actually ended earning more income now that they are unemployed relative to what they received before when they were working. So it's a very important transfer. There is a broader eligibility. So also furloughed workers receive it. People who are self-employed have access to this program. People in the gig economy as well. At the same time, undocumented workers are not eligible, even though they contributed to economic activity in the US significantly. It's very important because they reduce the poverty risk. And as I told you before, because lower income individuals tend to consume more as a result of a government transfer, they may also have the potential of a greater aggregate effect. Okay, what is the problem of this program? The problem is, again, some fairness issues. Perhaps depending on the state, some people unemployed in Washington state end up receiving much more unemployment benefits, for example, than someone in a neighboring state. And some people say that is not fair. We should actually index this unemployment benefit to something else, or we should phase it out depending on other unemployment benefits that people receive. At the same time, these are great ways to provide relief, but also they're bad for incentives. Why is that? Because if people receive more income when they are unemployed relative to when they worked, they will not be willing to work when they're having the opportunity of doing so. So strategically, it's very important to phase them out when the time is right. The time is right is a very tricky question because we need the economy to recover. Okay, so the third program is actually higher in terms of government disbursement relative to the other two programs, is the Paycheck Protection Program. So one issue that people had with the unemployment pandemic assistance, as I mentioned before, is that it severed job relationships. So of course, it's good that people are not poor when they lose their job, which is great, but at the same time, perhaps they may lose, they may still depreciate somewhat their human capital. So instead, some people proposed to give loans to small businesses, and these loans are actually transformed into a grant. They're forgiven under specific circumstances. For example, if the firm maintains people on their payroll, they don't fire people, they don't reduce the wage that much below a certain. So this is a great program in principle, but he wanted to keep, maintain employment, maintain capacity. So capacity is the firm is not going to shut down. A small business owner is not going to shut down because of this very important loan. The problem, however, and this is actually something we learned about, this is an incredible spending program, but the US and other countries as well, for that matters, did not have the capacity of being able to spend so quickly. And so initially, there's a big problem about transparency, meaning that some people, even though they wanted to be, they were rightly eligible for the PPP program, they were not able to receive it. Why? Because they did not have a special relationship with the bank, for example, so this affected minorities a lot. And also there was there was a fear of fraud. Some people actually ended up receiving huge amounts of funds, and they did not end up increasing employment significantly. So even though this program had a very plausible and ambitious goal in theory, the effect in practice remains uncertain, unclear. We need to collect more data. So the economists who have done some research on this data have had some inconclusive results. Some of them have found an increase in employment, and two of them actually have found no effect on employment at all. Okay, so let's take a look now. Let's try, these are very important income support programs. And what I want to see, I want to take a look at the aggregate personal income earned in the US. This is the income earned by families. And today we heard how much GDP in the US has fallen, significant drop in GDP. But interestingly, and actually because of this program, the data that we have up to now, again, it really depends on what's going to happen next. If you look at the data here, on the first row, you have the personal income before taxes and transfers. Then we have the taxes that need to be subtracted from the personal income. And the net transfers are actually the transfers between people and the government. And finally, if we add the transfers and subtract taxes to the first row, we have the disposable personal income. So despite this incredible drop in economic activity, surprisingly, the aggregate income to households has actually increased in April and May relative to what it was in February. So this is telling us how big, how substantial the government transfer was. Of course, June could be a different issue, but again, in May, families earn more than they did in January, despite all these events. So it's a very significant thing. At the same time, as I told you before, it's difficult to take some results that apply to the aggregate and apply it to the individual households. That's very difficult because indeed, there were many people who were very vulnerable. And the average is somewhat misleading here. So we need to take it with caution, especially minorities suffered from the circumstances despite this significant income transfer program. So now let's take a look at employment data. Employment data. Sorry, I need to go back. Employment data. So here, now we're focusing on the groups of the US population. And as you can see here, I normalized the total employment in February to be equal to an index equal to 100, and then look at the index over time. So to take a look at the first row, you see that in June, the index is equal to 90, which means that employment to men in the US fell by 10 percentage points. So as you can see here, again, this is a lesson. The aggregate hides individual effects. And as you can see here, the different groups have been affected differently. So there is also some component that we need to address. Despite this significant transfer income, how come the different groups are responding differently? And so here we're looking at employment. Some people can say the different groups may be working in sectors that are hurt differently. That's a good objection. But then I want to share with you another interesting set of data. And this is data by Robert Fairley, and he did a very nice paper on NBR. He's actually looking at the number of business owners, and he looks at the change of the business owners between February to May. So again, we're talking in May, people already had access to the Paycheck Protection Program. And as you can see here, the predicted percentage change column refers to the actual sector in which the different groups were working, were actually business. So these are actually business owners where their firm was operating. So for example, given the number of men allocation in the different sectors, we expected the number of men business owners to drop by 15 percentage points. It actually fell by less. So this actually means that men did relatively better than expected. Conversely, women actually did much worse than expected. So given their sectors, we expected the number of women business owners to fall by 10 percentage points, but it actually fell by much more, by 16 percentage points instead. So here we also have different races, ethnicities, and we see different responsiveness. And so we need to understand also not only the aggregate, as I mentioned before, how come the different groups are affected in somewhat different ways. Many people really compare the native workers with the foreign-born workers, because the foreign-born includes people who are both documented and undocumented here. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics up to now includes undocumented workers, and we see a big difference in the actual losses relative to expected. So now I will pass the presentation to Paola.
So when we talk about individual welfare and we want to see how a certain situation or a certain policy affects individual, as Andrea was mentioning, in addition to looking at income, we should also look at consumption. And so what I want to discuss is the effect that the pandemic had on the consumption of essential goods and on income. And the income itself had a feedback effect on the consumption of essential income goods and services. And then we're going to analyze the government response. So how the government tried to address the shortages of several several goods and services. So when we talk about shortages, the first thing that comes to mind during the pandemic is the shortages of PPE and medical equipment. This was very clear from the very beginning. The beginning of the crisis was in New York, and the state of New York had lack of PPE and ventilators in particular. So this shortage was due to a lack of internal production. And the reason is that in the past 10, 15 years, the US have outsourced its production of certain medical equipment and PPE to other countries, in particular China. And so given that the COVID-19 is a global crisis, it's not just a US crisis, of course, everybody needed access to PPE and medical equipment. And as a result, there was a decrease in import of these products from abroad. So now what were the policies and what were the actions that were taken? So on one hand, with the Defense Production Act, the president could impose the production of certain products to certain firms and manufacturers, and there was the need of building up stockpiles. Now, in this process, we have a very recent example that just a couple of days ago, President Trump gave a loan of almost $800 million to Kodak to transform its production from photography products to medical and pharmaceutical products. And Kodak was just a few years ago was going bankrupt. So, and within 2 days, the stock price increased dramatically because it has turned production to something else with this loan. Now, in addition to building up stockpiles, the government has another fundamental role, which is to establish a fair and efficient allocation mechanism. So what we have seen is that, for example, for medical equipment and PPE, there was a competition from the different states to get ventilators or to get PPEs. And so when we couple this with the increased demand from abroad, we obviously expect an increase in prices. And this is exactly what happened for these products. And so for something to keep in mind, a lesson for the future is that it's very important to build up the stockpiles, but also think about how to allocate them in times of needs. Next, I want to talk about healthcare. I'm going to talk about the healthcare, food, and housing that are considered the main essential products. And so here what we want to do is to see how the pandemic affected the consumption of this product, because we have seen that disposable income has increased. But as Andrea was saying, this has also been coupled with more inequality. And so what we want to see is whether these programs have reached the most vulnerable, and if they have been able to afford the basic necessity, these essential products. So when we think about healthcare, the pandemic has had a very similar effect to the crisis of 2008. As a result of the pandemic, there was a loss of employment, and this led to a loss of health insurance. Now, in the US, health insurance is very much related to employment. In other countries, healthcare and employment are kind of separate, and very often the healthcare is provided by the government. But here in the US, healthcare is very much related to health insurance, and health insurance is provided mostly by the employers. So as a result of the increase in unemployment, there was a decrease in number of people with insurance. And this in turn led to failure to receive testing and treatment. When people do not have access to health insurance and therefore see an increased cost of testing and treatments, they give that up. And so this, of course, makes the pandemic worse, because of course the testing is a crucial element for fighting the pandemic. So what were the government response? The Family First Coronavirus Response Act required the insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid to cover COVID-19 testing. So what we have heard almost since the beginning, or very quickly after the beginning of the pandemic, is that testing is free. There was scarcity of tests, but then in terms of access to tests, that had to be provided for free. Now, for the uninsured, there was also an appropriation in the Act so that they could also be tested for free. But the Family First Act had the problem that the patient continued cost sharings for treatment. And so they could be tested, but the treatment was still very costly. And so with the CARES Act, there was an expansion of interventions. And so there was a large amount, $100 billion, set aside for hospitals and healthcare providers so that they would have an incentive to reduce the cost to employed, to insured and uninsured. So these responses were significant, but for many were not enough. And so there were several suggestions to how, what other policies could be introduced. And one was, for example, to freeze the insurance status so that even if people lost the job, they would not lose insurance. Or, for example, expanding access to Medicare. And so this is a sector where a lot still could be done. Next, I will analyze the effect of the pandemic on consumption and availability of food. And so the unemployment and the disruption in supply chain also created a shortage of food. And so that obviously resulted in increased prices. The unemployment caused a decrease in income. And so this reduced food security. Another aspect of the availability of food relates to children, because for social distances, schools were closed, and this became a very big problem because many children received their meals from the school. And so the school lunch program, the school breakfast program, and the child and adult care food program used to serve 35 million of children. And with school closure, these children no longer had access to this provision of food. And this program generally provide up to 2/3 of the daily nutritional needs of children. And so this is obviously a problem because it also further increases the inequality across different groups. So the response to the government was to allow states to provide food stamps, and also in the CARES Act introduced appropriation for food stamp and child nutrition programs. Now, in addition to the federal response, there was also a local response because states and schools try to do their part to supplement the government, the intervention of the federal government. And so, for example, in South Carolina, the Department of Education introduced some grab-and-go sites where families with children could get up to 5 days of meals at once. In Michigan and in New York, there were programs of deliveries of meals, and so there were, again, some responses here. And from the federal perspective, we talked about the introduction of food stamps, but there are still some problems because when school is not in place, it's not as easy as it was before to reach the most vulnerable groups. Then finally, I want to talk about housing. So again, the loss of employment due to the pandemic brought a loss of income. and as a result, the inability to pay rent, the inability to pay mortgage, and therefore evictions. And what happened is that made the situation even worse is that people that without a home have larger exposure to the pandemic. And so for people who lost housing, they also became more vulnerable to the virus. So there were two main types of policies. It started with the states' policies, and so several states introduced a moratorium on rent payments, and they also suspended evictions. And so, for example, in the state of New York, it was initially supposed to be June 30, and then it was prolonged. But the idea is that as long as this crisis is in place, people cannot be evicted because they don't have money to pay rent. And there was still the problem for homeowners because on one hand, some of them had their income from the apartments that they were renting out, and some others that were not renting still had to pay mortgage. And so the federal government introduced some temporary reduction in mortgage payments. So what we have seen when we've looked at the consumption of these essential products is that, again, there were interventions that had the goal of supporting income. Now, in part, this supporting income has translated into a support in consumption of essential resources, but not completely, because we see that there have been shortages, there have been increases in prices, and the response of the government, both at the federal and state level, has not been entirely sufficient.
Okay, so let me conclude our presentation to summarize the points that we discussed together. We saw that this is an extraordinary crisis which required unprecedented intervention, and it was indeed the scale of government transfers is very vast. What we also learned in that what all these transfer programs allowed governments to develop capacity. So we learned about the delays, how difficult it was to actually provide benefits to different people for different reasons. And so this capacity, of course, hopefully we're not going to use it that much into the future, but it's actually good to be prepared by having some facilities and some lending facilities, some provisions, and some actually stockpiling that Paula mentioned before. And that could be really useful as an insurance policy for the future. You know, despite the success at the aggregate level, there are also some problems of targeting. Not everyone benefited from it. Everyone on average, so far, households have actually been compensated. The issue is also the expiration of these benefits, which is going to happen soon. Paula mentioned very importantly that despite the income transfers, there's many shortage problems in some very important goods and services. As I mentioned before, the vulnerable people are minorities, and also one important category of people who has not really benefited at all during this time are given by the low-income essential workers. These people actually had to work. They had to risk their life because of the pandemic. They were not paid that much, and they would have rather be unemployed because, as I told you before, the unemployment benefit was a very significant boost. So this category of people needs some targeted program in the future. So there's still some open questions for the future at this point. What we really put aside is whether these significant spending programs or transfer programs are going to be sustainable in the future? Of course they're not. So they need to end at some point. But the issue is, when should they end, right? So we need to consider the government deficit. We need to consider the government debt. But what we cannot do, we cannot stop these programs when it's too early. Because if we do that, then the damage that we wanted to prevent, and we somewhat prevented it, is going to happen. And so it's a very difficult question here to have, because sometimes we can say we're running out of money, but at the same time, we still need some resources of support and relief. So we're getting into the politics here, because of course different parties may have different priorities in mind, and the elections, the election coming soon, so it becomes a complicated issue. But definitely what we learned by actually doing this is that this is important, and it cannot stop if the pandemic remains a problem. But then, if the pandemic is solved, we need to actually get out of this very quickly, because that would be a terrible mistake. So thank you very much, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. If you have a question, you can raise your hand down on the bottom left in the participants tab. I think we're going to start off with one question by, from Bill. Should we give people $600 if they are in minimum wage jobs as well as unemployed?
Right. So, I mean, the issue is what is the right amount? What is the right amount of this transfer? And we need to be, again, I think that the need of getting to a solution quickly made it difficult to really think about what is the right compensation. And, you know, $600 per week for everyone is a simple solution. But at the same time, once we have some time to think about it, what is the right amount? What was your income before when you were working? Should we index the unemployment benefit to that? Should we reduce the benefit if your state is more generous in unemployment benefit? And we should give more unemployment benefits to states where there is no such program. How about unionized workers who receive unemployment benefits as well? How about, you know, minimum wage jobs? What is the right amount? This is an important question, and at this point, the Republican-controlled Senate has proposed to reduce the unemployment benefit to $200. The unemployment benefit is expected to expire tomorrow, and the House is actually proposing to continue the unemployment benefit still $600 until January. So again, is there room for an agreement? It's not clear, but I'm not very fond of the idea of giving everyone the same amount. I personally, that's my opinion.
Thank you. Flora?
Yes. I have a question for Professor Barbara. So do you think the financial support program has some impact on the stock market? To be more specific, do you think there are more money or capital available because of this program in the stock market, and this will probably cause some like stock price going up because of this? Or I don't know, I just confused over this.
Sure, no, I think what is surprising about this pandemic is that stock prices have fallen, but they have not fallen as much. Some people thought that financial markets were actually had information that we did not have. They were more optimistic than people were. Now they are responding to information in different ways. Some people claim, how come stock markets have not dropped as we could have thought, given the difficult circumstances? Some people think it's not the support by the Treasury, but it is the indirect support by the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is actually not directly helping people, but the Federal Reserve is indirectly buying a significant amount of Treasury bonds, corporate bonds, supporting municipal bonds for the first time. And so also the purchase programs of the Fed is clearly making sure that asset prices remain high. So what's interesting about this crisis, this is not a financial crisis. This is a different kind of crisis. Up to this point, the financial sector has not been hurt as much. But again, another reason why we want to do all this, in addition to be generous, perhaps the financial sector is grateful because we prevented another financial crisis from happening.
Okay, cool. So I have another, just to clarify, I saw your data for the employment, which shows that employment increases, right? I'm just confused. I think the unemployment increases.
No, that was the number of employed people. That was the number of employed people.
Okay, cool. Okay, gotcha. Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll take one of the questions in the chat because government programs have had less of an impact on Black, Indigenous, and persons of colors community, what kind of programs would target this community better? And suggestion is student debt forgiveness. Yeah, it's definitely true that these programs have been not entirely successful in reaching the most vulnerable groups. But at the same time, they definitely have been more successful compared to, for example, just like transfers of income. And this is a discussion. This is typical discussion that we have in economics. What is the effect on consumption, and what is it that we want to achieve? So what we see is that when we transfer income, then people decide how to use it. And also, as Andrea was saying, with the unemployment insurance, in this specific case, it was not targeted according to the income received prior to unemployment, or not tied to any other unemployment benefit that the person receives. And so the programs that are directed to food, housing, schools, education is another problem that I haven't discussed explicitly, but that also is an issue because it may lead to further inequality. The issue is not that these are wrong policies or wrong sectors to target. It's that something more should be done, and also the benefits should also be extended to undocumented workers and people who right now are not reached by these programs.
Great, thank you. Gaurav?
Yeah, thank you, Professor Andrea and Professor Paolo, for your very insightful presentation. So my question is, any one of you could answer perhaps, but now, is there a case for introducing universal basic income in some form in the US now, given that we have seen that targeting is really problematic, and then there is a reluctance now in terms of extending the relief measures further, while we are still in the midway of the pandemic? So do you feel like UBI in
No,
some
no,
form?
I think that's your policy memo, right? I got it.
Yeah,
I haven't gotten back at you, so sorry.
no.
So
I didn't
yes,
ask because of that.
yeah. No, I think it's a good observation. So again, we need to have some capacity to provide help when it's needed, and the universal basic income is one way of helping those who don't work, because we're going to provide an income to everyone, no matter what they do. So it's actually the simplicity of the universal basic income is great. So some people are afraid that there could be some problems with the incentive, right? The incentive compatibility. So perhaps if you provide something to everyone, no matter what, they may have an incentive not to work. So it should be thought, I think there is a greater and greater demand for UBI, which has many advantages, but I think it needs to be qualified to a certain extent to avoid, I think we really need to help those who don't work. But then we also want to make sure that people do work, because if they don't work, they depreciate the human capital. There's something that is going to be affected by that. So there is a benefit in non-severing these work relationships. And so we need to make sure that UBI does that and does not create incentive to not work. But it's a very appropriate point.
Thank you.
Next we have Chi-Hong Chen.
Yeah, hi, thank you, professors. So I'm curious what's your take on the future of government purchases and investment, given the high debt level and also the possibility of corporate taxes hikes. Are those inevitable trade-offs, and what's your take on that?
So I think it's what the government has done up to this point. The government has spent a lot of money on government transfers, not much on government spending on goods and services or infrastructure. So there is not that much government investment here. Of course, human capital is an important investment, but the government has not done spent that much. So there is an issue of sustainability, and some people are concerned that perhaps there is a crowding out effect. So the government is spending correctly a lot on transfers. There will be less spending on government provided infrastructure investment, when before the pandemic, the issue was perhaps we need a greater government spending on those areas. So again, the question remains, perhaps if we consider this as a war, after the war, you need to invest a lot to increase the capacity of the country. So perhaps that could be an important thing to do. The issue, as I told you before, is the sustainability. But at the same time, it is possible, not for sure, that if this government investment is well done, it will increase the capacity so much that we don't need to worry that much about the debt. After all, what matters is not the government debt itself, is the debt relative to something, relative to GDP. So if we do it smartly, it may not be a problem. But the risk is that we don't do it smartly and the debt remains a problem.
Thank you.
We have a question from Professor Adela Gondek. She put in the chat, but I'm not sure if she wants to. Yeah. Regarding school food programs, the cost of the food purchased and distributed but left unconsumed, together with the cost of USDA reimbursements for wasted food, is estimated to be anywhere from $5 to $16 million per day. Could food waste be addressed in some way? So rather than waste it, the funds could be applied more productively, perhaps to other needs of vulnerable populations.
Sure, this is definitely a good point, but this again goes to the problem of targeting these programs, because very often the waste is also because the products cannot reach the most vulnerable, and so definitely it's a point that should be addressed, but it has the same problems of the ability of being targeted.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I think we're nearing the end, and we don't have any other questions. I think we'll wrap up. I want to thank you both for this great presentation, very insightful, went into all the different facets, and thank you for joining us, and thank all the participants.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, guys. Thank you all.